Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume. I'm so pleased to be joined today by Frank Debets to talk about the outlook for a region that accounts for more than half of global trade, Asia. Frank, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Sindhu.
So I want to point out that we are at PwC's Customs and International Trade meeting in Dallas, where we are talking about trade, tariffs, customs, supply chain, all of it.
Yes.
And you are based in Singapore and have been there for 25 years.
Correct.
So I'm really glad to get your perspective on some of these issues. So can you let's talk about the overall trade policy environment in Asia, and I'd also like to know all of the, I'm just going to say, chaos that we have been experiencing here in the United States. How is it being perceived over there, and what is the perception on trade?
Wow, that's a wide question. I mean, to start with, perhaps the first few words that you mentioned, the overall trade policy. I think there's so much diversity in Asia that it's very hard to talk about a single trade policy because different territories have very different objectives. But when you look, maybe some overall comments, I think there's still very much a focus on growth in international trade. Now, I'm based in Singapore, and of course, Singapore without international trade would probably cease to exist. But other territories look at it differently. China, Vietnam, very much export-oriented. Other territories perhaps more balanced. If you look at the territories within ASEAN, for example, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, they tend to compete with each other for investment, but also for access to overseas markets. So it's quite a bit of a mix. But there is still, I think, overall the sense that trade facilitation, growth in international trade, openness of markets is a good thing and would help their populations.
Are you seeing a shift to regionalized supply chains in Asia?
Not maybe as much as you would think. Perhaps when you read the press reports, it's easy to state in a meeting, whether you're a politician or a reporter or a journalist, to say, well, there's changes in supply chains and regionalization. I think it's more nuanced than that. Yes, there is perhaps a concern that doing business with certain markets, particularly the US, and that's why we're here, is a little bit under threat. So companies are certainly looking at what can we do? And one of the questions is, well, where are other markets that we can go for? The same with the governments. They say, well, okay, maybe we need to negotiate in a way that supports our economies more broadly than perhaps having to rely on whether it's the US with tariffs or the EU with environmental regulations and so on and so forth. But whether that leads to more regionalization, I'm not so sure. And if you look at, say, ASEAN again as a bloc, intra-ASEAN trade has been steady at about 20 to 25% of total trade. That's very low. And the EU at 70, 75%, Mercosur is higher. That hasn't budged. And so still, I think there is a lot of companies, a lot of territories in ASEAN that are looking at outside territories, the richer markets of the EU, North America, the US, particularly in the EU, as their target, and not so much the regional countries, despite them negotiating the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the CPTPP, all those FTAs, there's so many of them that it's hard to keep track of them. And so they take advantage of those, but not in a way that you say, well, now the focus is intra-regional. Right. And no longer outside of the region.
All right, let's get into talking about companies and the reaction to a very, frequently changing trade landscape. So, just as an example, if there are tariffs implemented, let's say between the United States and Canada, there is some impact felt by companies. Is that impact being felt over there? And how are companies preparing and kind of adjusting to the rapid amount of change?
It's an excellent question, and I would wish more companies would ask me that question. The question that I guess most commonly in Asia is, what is everybody else doing? And my answer usually is,
what do you mean by everybody, though? Who are
other companies?
Other companies. Okay.
So and my answer usually is, well, they're asking me what you're doing. And so it's a bit, and as a result, a lot of companies are kind of seem to be still in not quite denial, but reluctance to do anything. They still feel that certainly the US policy changes, it's on the other side of the world. The disputes with Canada and Mexico doesn't really impact them. Even talk about actions against the EU. Seems to be this feeling, well, that's on the other side of the world.
Sure.
Yet I think some companies that do their homework do realize that even if they're not directly impacted, they're indirectly impacted. Their customers, their suppliers, perhaps also supplies, competition, the competitive landscape changing, and so on and so forth. And I think far more companies should really be looking at their trade data and working out what is the impact and what are our options and how should we react.
Right.
Now, at the same time, I would think, having been in Asia for that long, that a lot of companies are kind of used to a very unpredictable regulatory landscape. And one of the senses I get when I speak to companies in the US or my colleagues in the US or in the EU, they're more used to a predictable regulatory landscape. And so in Asia, I think there is a little bit of that sense, well, we'll deal with whatever comes our way, because we've been having to do that for decades.
So kind of responding in real time.
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Correct.
Okay.
Let me give you a very key example. Quite a few years ago, Vietnam introduced legislation overnight saying this type of product as of tomorrow has to be imported through this port. And so there was companies saying, well, we have a ship going to a different port. What do we do? And so clearly that's not ideal. But I think the level of agility in Asia is probably a little bit better with organization, because you have to do that to survive.
So we are filming this on March 26th. And I would like to know if you think about going out 9 to 12 months, let's say. And I know you don't have a crystal ball, but how do you anticipate companies in Asia kind of charting their path when it comes to trade, tariffs, supply chains, and all of that, knowing what's happening on the other side of the world and, everywhere else in between?
I worry a little bit that they won't be doing enough. And so that in 9 to 12 months' time, we're going to be in a situation where some companies are simply paying more tariffs. They might have lost market share. Maybe some companies might have gone out of business because they haven't planned enough. At the same time, I also think there are quite a few companies that are looking around to say, well, where is our market? Where do we sell our products? And perhaps if it's not or less in the US,
Sure.
there's other markets, whether it's in the region or in Latin America or the Middle East or Africa. And so I think if you look 9, 12 months ahead, I don't think for them the world is that changed, partly because also it's not so easy to change supply chains, suppliers. There's contracts to deal about. You certainly can't move factories around very easily. So I think a lot of companies might be struggling a little bit from a profitability perspective. I would hope that they're more advanced in understanding the impact and their options, which I think they don't do quite yet. But if they maybe live through 9 months of perhaps a little bit of pain, they're clearer about what their options are and can have some strategies for the years from there on.
Okay, that's a long time with pain.
Yes.
And finally, if you could, one or two things, if you could say to companies, I think it's really important to do this now.
The first and foremost thing, which I think I alluded to earlier, is get your trade data and understand what's moving across which borders. Because surprisingly, perhaps many companies, even the largest multinational, do not have a good handle on that. Now, in some territories, again, like the US, it's relatively easy to get that data. Around Asia, it's very hard to get that data, and ERP systems are simply not up to speed. They don't capture that real-time data from various sources. So that's one thing for companies. You have to know, because otherwise, one, you don't know what your impact is, and two, you don't know what your mitigation options are. And so that's the second point then. Start planning for different scenarios, because you can't predict the future, but you should be in a position to say, well, if this happens, then these are my 3 options, and I'm ready to pull a trigger.
Frank, this has been really great. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks for being here.